Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Dr. Moreno and I will be covering bioenergetics of exercise. This is lecture part 1 of 2, and as always, I am a mom of 2. So if you hear my children in the background, that is why. Let's get started. As always, here are your key terms and objectives. A really good way to know if you understand what these terms mean and what these objectives, the concepts, are really trying to explain is go through them and try to explain and define them yourself. In addition to that, try to explain them to a classmate, a peer, someone not in our field, and see if you can apply the concepts and teach them yourselves. Okay, bioenergetics overview. What requires energy? Everything, right? When you go snowboarding, play basketball, run, study diligently for exercise physiology, hang out with friends, and even sleep. Your body is always going to require a large amount of energy. This is known as ATP molecules. An ATP molecule is the basic form of energy. So how do we get this? When you eat food, you're providing that raw material necessary that your body needs to synthesize that ATP. So we eat carbs, fats, proteins. That is the raw material. It then goes through multiple processes to synthesize ATP. That is what we're discussing in this chapter. We're talking about the energy systems that use this raw material to form ATP. Okay? So the energy needed to recharge ATP stems from what's known as ADP. Okay? So we ultimately want to end up with a lot of ATP, a lot of energy, but it has to come from somewhere. All right? So we're going to talk about this process. In order to use it, we have to break it down. Once it's broken down, it needs to rebuild back up. And it's that cycle that we're discussing. So that involves ATP and ADP. We'll talk about it in a little bit, and it's in the PowerPoints later on. But T is for three phosphates. Okay, so tri, P phosphates, di for 2 phosphates. So it goes from 3 phosphates down to 2 phosphates and then rebuild back up to 3 to 2. So it always goes through that process, and we'll talk more about it, and there's a photo of that as well later in the PowerPoint. Okay. In bioenergetics, food molecules, glucose. So what is glucose stemming from? What raw material? Carbohydrates, right, are broken down to be converted. So this process occurs in and around this powerhouse of energy known as the mitochondria. Okay, the mitochondria is a pill rod looking shape form inside the cell, and we'll have again pictures and everything for you to see later on to show you exactly what this is really doing for us. So here's some vocabulary. Bioenergetics, what is that? It's the quantitative study of energy transduction that occurs in living cells. Your body is a living cell, right? So we have to talk about how energy is produced and synthesized, that chemical reaction. Okay? It is the nature and function of the chemical processes underlying these transductions. Simply put, it's a study of energy in living things, which we are a living thing. Energy metabolism. So let's skip down to metabolism real quick. What is metabolism? To change, okay? This includes the process of anabolism and catabolism. So anabolism is to simply build up. Catabolism is to break down. So think of a cat. What does a cat do to a couch? It breaks things down, right? A at the beginning of the alphabet. We're starting So we're building, okay? So anabolism, the raw material that we eat, plus the breakdown of that raw material is our metabolism as a whole. So let's go back to energy metabolism. It involves utilizing the food that we eat, that raw material, carbs, fats, protein, to store energy in the form of ATP, right? So you see that, adenosine triphosphate. We have 3 phosphates for the primary energy cell, okay? Last 2 definitions, we have aerobic and anaerobic. For this chapter, simply we want to make sure we understand that aerobic utilizes oxygen. Anaerobic activity does not. Now, I'm not saying you're not breathing, okay? It is the type of activity that we are participating in. For instance, long, slow duration activities such as running for long distances. A marathon requires oxygen, meaning the muscle, the energy systems to sustain that specific activity requires oxygen. Whereas anaerobic, like a sprint, think of Usain Bolt, that 100-meter sprint. His muscle, or our muscle providing that sprint, does not require oxygen to sustain energy and for the muscle to complete that task. And we'll talk about when oxygen is required and how it kicks on and all of that as well. So we have approximately percentages of aerobic versus anaerobic contributions to ATP production. So let's talk about aerobic versus anaerobic just a little bit more. Here on the left-hand side, you see the activities. These activities explain or show different types. So we have resistance training, which is low repetitions, high resistance. That is primarily done quickly. So that means it's going to be done in a short period of time for each set. Not talking about the whole workout, per set. So that will be primarily 100% anaerobic performance. Now let's jump all the way to the bottom. We see a marathon runner. We know, aerobically speaking, they're primarily going to be using 100% aerobic performance because it's 26 miles. They have to last a really long time. There can be argument. Anaerobic work for a marathon runner can have a little bit of anaerobic work in there. There might be points in time where they might sprint to get around a person, so they would have some anaerobic influence as well. Now if we go right in the middle, an 800-meter run, we have 50% aerobic and 50% anaerobic work. Okay? So why is this important? Why do you need to know this? It's valuable to coaches and athletes for organizing practice times and designing optimal training programs. For instance, football versus boxers. We have sparring, we have med ball, anaerobic work, and distance running, which is aerobic work. Right? So we have to make sure that we're appropriately prescribing training that fits the athlete's needs. Does a football athlete need to run 26 miles? Do they need to run 5 miles? No. Why? Do they do that in their sport? Absolutely not, right? So that's why this graph is critical, to know the percentage contribution of energy for each system. Okay? So let's talk a little bit more about the anaerobic versus aerobic. So aerobic metabolism involves the use of oxygen in the breakdown of carbs, fats, and proteins to produce ATP. Remember those 3 raw materials for our metabolism to utilize and synthesize what molecule? ATP. Fat, carbs, protein. These are the 3 raw materials that are utilized to form energy. Now, I will say this. Protein is not a primary energy source for any energy system. Carbohydrates and fat are your 2 primary energy sources. We'll get later into proteins and talk a little bit about how proteins are able to provide us with energy, but that's not the main purpose of protein. We don't want it to give us energy, really. The focus for this PowerPoint, we're really focusing on the carbohydrate pathway, okay? So again, carbohydrates, we convert glucose to pyruvate. This is the exact same as glycolysis. And I have diagrams for you a little later also. Pyruvate enters the mitochondria of the cell and is converted to acetyl-CoA and continues to metabolize through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system. So let's stop right there. The first energy system to turn on, we know it's from the anaerobic pathway. So we have ATP-PCR. First energy system to turn on. The second energy system to turn on is glycolysis. Glycolysis, however, has 2 pathways. The first pathway to turn on, anaerobic glycolysis. 2B is aerobic glycolysis. And finally, the third and final energy system to kick on to provide us with the greatest amount of energy possible, Krebs. Krebs cycle. There is some other names for that. Krebs cycle, aerobic system. Any of those are fine for you to remember. Okay? So here's the breakdown. Carbohydrates to produce anaerobically. So that raw carbohydrate material is utilized for anaerobic energy. Fat is the primary. But carbohydrates and proteins are also used to produce ATP aerobically. So you can see the color coding there. Green for anaerobically because it's quick energy. We're utilizing it really fast. Aerobic because it's slow, but it gets us a lot. Okay? So we're really focusing on that middle column. The breakdown of carbohydrates. We're metabolizing carbohydrates. Once we eat that raw carbohydrate material, it gets broken down to glucose. It goes through the process of glycolysis, the intermediate step of pyruvate, and the final step in glycolysis is acetyl-CoA. It's kind of a crossover because acetyl-CoA is also the first step in Krebs. Now, this is showing you energy system number 2 and energy system number 3. ATP-PCR is our first energy system to turn on, right? It simply provides us with energy. It does not form new energy for us to use. So ATP-PCR is that energy that's readily available for us to use again immediately. But it dissipates quickly because there's not a whole lot. There's not a lot of storage in the muscle for us to hold a lot of that ATP. So we're really focusing on glycolysis, the green, and Krebs, the red. Okay, so let's take a break from energy systems for a minute. Let's talk about enzymes. We've been saying that we eat this raw material, carbs, fats, proteins, and then it gets broken down. But how are we really getting this food to get broken down? Through enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that have very specific properties and functions. They cause the conversion of a reactant, also known as a substrate. Okay. The production of ATP involves through that aerobic and anaerobic energy system, but has to require this enzymatic steps to take place. So let's talk about that a little bit. Three primary responsibilities of enzymes. 1, to speed up or to catalyze a reaction. So we're going to make a process go much faster, or we're going to break down a specific reaction. So a reactant will convert to a product. Okay, you see here we have a substrate, which ultimately ends in that product. That's our final goal. But the process will take considerably longer. Okay? During exercise, ATP is used continuously. It is used even during the enzyme process. So we can't just use ATP for exercise. We have to utilize it for other processes in addition to exercise. So again, during exercise, ATP is used continuously through enzymes that are required to convert these reactants to products, meaning that raw material to ATP. We need to do this at an accelerated rate necessary to meet the demands of that activity. Now, we know for sprinting, that doesn't always happen the way we would like, right? So we have to rely on other energy systems. So number 2, does not change the end result or the reactant. So the same product will appear. So with or without the enzymes, the same product will happen, but it just takes longer. And finally, enzymes, they are not changed when catalyzes a reaction, meaning enzymes can function repeatedly to convert many molecules. Okay? So the purpose of this enzyme is to really look at this slide. The lock and key mechanism. Enzyme is the key. This is the protein that binds to a very specific substrate. And it fits precisely to catalyze that reaction. You see in the diagram how it fits perfectly. It's lock and key. The enzymes vary greatly in turnover rate. So this turnover rate from step 1 enzyme to enzyme substrate complex to product, that is known as the turnover rate. How fast that takes place depends on the proteins, depends on the energy system that is being utilized and utilizing that enzyme, and also the weakest link enzyme. So if your link within this turnover rate, you have a very slow enzyme, you're only as fast as your weakest link. So that turnover rate, it's the efficiency and effectiveness which an enzyme can convert a reactant to a product to determine its turnover rate. So it's defined, right? Enzymes vary greatly to turn over a substrate to a product. So the slowest turnover rate is called the rate limiting enzyme for glycolysis. So there is a weakest link in the second energy system of glycolysis, known as PFK, phosphofructose kinase. The series of enzyme reaction will proceed no faster than the rate limiting enzyme will allow. So this is your weakest link. This is the weakest chain in that metabolic pathway. So you can see in the diagram here, you're only moving as fast as your slowest person on the team. Even if you are able to go faster, you're a part of the whole system. Why do we care? Why do we care about energies? Why do we care about enzymes? Enzymes also help prime. Okay, so temperature and pH levels, the turnover rate of an enzyme rises and falls. as temperature and pH levels increase. So at low or high temperatures or even your pH levels, enzymes are least effective. So my point is, if you warm up before you perform your activity, this may actually provide a benefit to your overall performance. This may provide your turnover rate to feel or to move a bit faster, which will optimally optimize your enzyme efficiency. Again, your end goal here is to obtain more ATP. This is the purpose. Turnover rate, raw material to ATP. If we can form ATP faster as a result of increasing the protein turnover rate because of warm-ups, why wouldn't we warm up? So think of your own workouts yourself. Think of a workout when you have warmed up properly versus a workout where you don't warm up at all. How do you feel? You probably feel a little sluggish and slower and not as much energy when you don't warm up effectively. Right? However, vigorous exercise can change pH levels. So anaerobic glycolysis ends in lactic, which decreases our cellular pH. Increases the acidity effects of the turnover rates in the glycolysis pathway, which ultimately is a reduction in ATP. This is kind of a holding page, a holding slide, if you will. I'm going to tell you about a couple of vitamins that are utilized in the process of synthesizing ATP, but we're going to put this in our back pocket once we get through this one slide until later on. Two molecules that are particularly important as it applies to exercise physiology are NAD and FAD. These are transfer molecules. They are B vitamins. B as in boy, vitamins provide us with energy. But NAD and FAD are not actual energy. They are the potential of energy. Okay, so we can utilize it for a later time. So we're going to remember these three letters, two of these three letters, so NAD and FAD, because they are within the glycolysis and Krebs cycle. But they're going to get broken down into and transferred into ATP at the end of the day. Okay, but just remember that these are essentially, I like to call them our shopping carts. When you go to the grocery store, you use a shopping cart to hold all your groceries. What are those groceries? That is the raw material for your energy. So NAD and FAD are your shopping carts to hold that energy until you're able to actually digest and utilize that raw material. Okay? Some more definitions here on the right-hand side. Enzymes we talked about. Merges is simply saying when enzymes are constantly breaking down reactions to get to the next step. It'll make more sense when you look at our diagram. Everything, great test question. Everything in the Krebs cycle, also known as oxidative system, aerobic system, is a catalyzed reaction. Meaning it's getting broken down until we get to the next step, until the next step, until the next step, until we finally are able to then synthesize the most amount of ATP. As a reminder, fuel for energy, that raw material, we have carbohydrates, carbs, CHO, fats, also known as lipids. If you see it as lipids in this PowerPoint or textbook, just know those are fats. And then protein, abbreviated as PRO. During exercise, the primary nutrients used for energy are fats and carbohydrates. Remember, ATP, PCR, and the first pathway of glycolysis primarily use only carbohydrates. The second pathway of glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, and Krebs utilize fats. Okay? With protein contributing a relatively small amount of total energy used. Typically, protein only provides us with about 2% of energy, and at most upwards of that 10%, and that's more towards that starvation mode. So it really does not provide us with it does not provide us with a lot of energy, protein. So how do we generate energy once nutrients are actually broken down? So we have this raw material. It is now synthesized into ATP. We have ATP. What do we do with it? ATP now has to get broken down and then resynthesized. This is known as ATP, ADP cycle. Here's our cycle. ATP, ADP cycle provides for storage and use of energy in living things. Energy is defined as the ability to do work. So we have two types. That potential, the ability to use that energy for a later date. Remember our shopping carts, NAD, FAD. And free, the energy that you are using at this exact moment to rest, to move, to sleep through this PowerPoint, right? So there's energy being utilized 24/7 within our body. So let's talk a little bit more. ATP, as mentioned before, three triphosphates, meaning we have 3 phosphates. So you see the yellow 3 P's, those are our phosphate bonds. That is where our energy is stored. Great test question. The greatest amount of energy is stored between the second and third phosphate bond, meaning the 2 farthest ones out. That's between the second and third. The first phosphate is attached to the ribose, the green. The second is in the middle, the third is the last one out. So the greatest amount of energy stored is between the second and third. There is, however, energy stored between the first and the second, just not as much. Okay, so you see in the diagram to the right, that's kind of going really fast in circles. You see you have 3 phosphates in black, and then all of a sudden we break down and use 2. And then we build up and have 3 again. Break down and go 2, build up and have 3 again. That is the ATP, where we're breaking off energy. We're left with 2 phosphates, and then we rebuild. Okay, think of a pencil. Back in the day, we used the number 2 pencils. Sometimes we still do. But if you break that pencil in half, what happens? You hear a loud snap. That's the release of energy. That's what we're doing. We're releasing that energy, and we're left with 2 phosphates, ADP, which is typically going to be used and combined with glucose to be able to resynthesize this whole process again. This is the ATP, ADP cycle. So what is needed in order for this process to continue? We need energy for this energy system to work, but we also need raw material. So we rebuild back up from ADP to ATP with the use of raw material that we digest. ATP. The definition: the immediate source of energy for muscular contraction is the high energy phosphate compound, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So if you look at the Bioenergetics handouts that I posted on eLearn, on the first page that's titled Energy Systems, you'll see the ATP ADP cycle from the previous page. Right? You'll have AT with 3 circles that you fill in with 3 phosphates. That goes down into AD, 2 circles with 2 phosphates. Okay, so the structure as a whole is made up of the adenosine, which is in orange on this page, the ribose, which is the sugar molecule, and then your 3 phosphate bonds. Remember, where is the greatest amount of energy stored? Between the second and third energy. Does that mean that there's no energy between the first and the second? No, there is. It's just not as much. Remember, energy transfer in the body occurs when the release of energy trapped within those chemical bonds between the phosphates are exposed. So reiterating that breakdown of ATP. At the top, we have the adenosine, the ribose, and the 3 phosphates. It gets broken down into ADP. You see the plus sign where the ADP is. It says it's creating more energy because we've broken that bond. We broke that pencil off. Now, what enzyme has to be a part of this process? Remember, in order to break something down, it needs an enzyme, a reaction, a catalyzed reaction to take place. So in order for ATP to get broken down into ADP, we have what's known as ATPase, ASE. If you ever see a word that ends with ASE, that means that it is an enzyme. So to break down ATP, like to break our pencil, we're using the enzyme ATPase. Now, in order to synthesize us back up, but still we have to form a product. So what we're going to be using then is ATP synthase, SYNTHASE, ATP synthase. Another part of this slide, each molecule, single ATP, provides approximately 7 to 10 calories of energy for muscular contraction, which is important for our calculations later on, but that's also a good multiple choice test question. So ATP is a part of every single energy system, ATP PCR, glycolysis, and Krebs. But now we're switching gears into the mitochondria. Mitochondria is strictly a part of the Krebs cycle. The mitochondria is located inside the cell. So think of a bubble. You have a single bubble, that's your cell. On the inside of that bubble, you have what's known as the mitochondria, this rod pill-looking shaped item. So the mitochondria, they are double membrane structures, meaning you have this lighter brown and then the darker brown, the double membrane, found in all cells of multicellular organisms. We have what's known as a cristae, which is that light brown wall. And inside that, you have this fluid, which is known as the matrix. Within that matrix, that's where the Krebs cycle is actually taking place. So it takes so much time for ATP to be synthesized because it has to cross both double membranes to get in and to get out and to utilize that energy. That's why it's such a slow process. Okay? The inner membrane builds up of hydrogen ions that help power ATP formation. Another good test question, right? So I'll repeat it. Inner membrane, the hydrogen ions build up to help power ATP formation. Okay? So again, this is important because the mitochondria is the powerhouse of energy. It forms so much energy, so much ATP, but it just takes a really long time for the process to be completed. Let's dive in a little bit further into the mitochondria. The function of a mitochondria is to generate energy that the cell needs, sometimes compared to as a power plant, releases energy, right? So it releases the ATP, primarily for aerobic work and recovery, okay? So in between your high bouts of performance, why can't we just continue at high intensities for hours and hours and hours? Because we don't have the energy to meet those demands. So we have to recover. We have to have rest periods. During that downtime, during the rest period, the Krebs cycle, which contains the mitochondria, provides us with that energy to recover because it's low intensity. It's considered essentially aerobic work. Okay? Synthesis of ATP is down through the Krebs cycle, which again, we have glucose, which stems from our carbohydrate, that raw material. From glucose, we go to that intermediate step of pyruvate to acetyl-CoA, which is that final step in glycolysis. But it doubles. Remember, acetyl-CoA is also the first step that merges to start the process of the Krebs cycle. And then you have NAD and FAD. Now, it has an H on it now. When we add the H, we're getting closer and closer to converting our vitamins or our shopping carts to actual energy, to actual ATP. Okay? So the mitochondria, your body's energy powerhouse, right? It takes time. You can see the clock, the black circle going around in circles. It does take time, but over a certain period of time, we're developing a lot more mitochondria. We have more mitochondria. We have more ability to produce energy known as the ATP.